In the early 1960s, far beneath the financial core of London, a quiet and carefully guarded alliance came into existence. It was an agreement few outside central banking circles ever knew about, yet its consequences would shape the fate of gold, the US dollar, and the global economy itself. This arrangement became known as the London Gold Pool. Its objective sounded simple, almost harmless: prevent the price of gold from rising. But behind that goal lay a far deeper fear. If gold prices rose freely, it would signal weakness in the dollar. And if confidence in the dollar collapsed, the entire post-World War II economic order risked falling apart. This was not a normal market operation. It was a defensive strategy in a monetary Cold War, an attempt by powerful institutions to manage reality itself. Gold had always been seen as the purest expression of value, free from politics and promises. Yet now, that very market was being quietly controlled by a small group of central bankers meeting behind closed doors. The London Gold Pool was not merely about stabilizing prices, it was about preserving trust, authority, and geopolitical dominance in a world still recovering from war. To understand why such a drastic and secretive plan was even considered necessary, one has to go back to the aftermath of World War II, when the global financial system lay in ruins. By the early 1940s, currencies across Europe and Asia had collapsed. Nations were exhausted, debt-ridden, and desperate for stability. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, with a single mission: rebuild the global monetary system and prevent the chaos that had fueled previous depressions and wars. The result was the Bretton Woods Agreement, a framework that reshaped global finance. Under this system, currencies around the world were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. In theory, this created a stable and elegant system. Every dollar in circulation was supposed to be backed by gold stored in US Treasury vaults. At the time, the United States held more than 20,000 tons of gold, nearly 3/4 of the world's known reserves. With such overwhelming reserves, the dollar appeared as solid as gold itself. Other nations accepted it as the foundation of global trade, reserves, and trust. The dollar became the centerpiece of the post-war economic order. But hidden within this design was a dangerous contradiction, a mathematical imbalance that would slowly grow into a crisis. For the system to function, the United States had to supply dollars to the rest of the world. Global trade required liquidity, and the dollar was the chosen medium. Yet every dollar that flowed overseas gave foreign governments the right to redeem those dollars for American gold. As more dollars circulated internationally, more claims were created against a finite supply of gold. The system demanded both expansion and restraint at the same time, an impossible balance. By the late 1950s, warning signs were already visible. American spending abroad had increased dramatically. Programs like the Marshall Plan, the maintenance of military bases across the world, and expanding Cold War commitments flooded foreign economies with dollars. European central banks began exercising their right to convert those dollars into gold. Slowly but steadily, gold flowed out of American vaults. In 1958 alone, U.S. gold reserves dropped by more than 10%. If this trend continued unchecked, the promise tying the dollar to gold would eventually break. Publicly acknowledging this danger was unthinkable. The strength of the dollar was not just an economic matter, it was a symbol of American power and leadership. Admitting weakness would undermine confidence not only in the currency, but in the political order built around it. So instead of confronting the structural flaw, policymakers looked for ways to conceal it. By 1961, a group of 8 Western central banks, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, decided to act in secret. Their goal was clear: prevent the free market from revealing the dollar's vulnerability. The chosen weapon was coordinated intervention in the gold market. At that time, London was the center of global gold trading. Each morning, major bullion dealers met to set the official gold price, a process that effectively determined gold's value worldwide. Any sustained move above $35 per ounce would send a powerful signal that confidence in the dollar was eroding. Under the London Gold Pool Agreement, the United States agreed to supply half of the gold needed for intervention. The remaining half came from the central banks of the United Kingdom, West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Whenever market demand threatened to push gold above the fixed price, these institutions would sell gold into the London market, increasing supply and forcing the price back down. On the surface, it appeared to be a clever and coordinated solution. At first, the strategy worked. For several years, the gold price remained stable. To the outside world, the Bretton Woods system seemed strong and reliable. Confidence appeared intact. But behind the scenes, pressure was building. Global trade continued to expand, increasing the demand for dollars. At the same time, U.S. government spending surged. The Vietnam War, domestic social programs, and growing overseas investments all required financing. More dollars were printed, yet gold reserves continued to shrink. By the mid-1960s, the numbers had become deeply troubling. Foreign governments held nearly 3 times more dollars than the total gold remaining in U.S. reserves. The entire system was now held together by confidence alone. The London Gold Pool functioned like a temporary dam, holding back a rising flood. Each intervention delayed the crisis, but also made the eventual collapse more severe. The situation worsened when France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly challenged the arrangement. De Gaulle criticized what he called America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to pay for imports and wars with paper dollars rather than real value. In 1965, France began converting its dollar reserves into gold and physically transporting the metal from New York to Paris. This act was more than economic policy. It was a direct political challenge to the system. Other countries quietly followed the same path. Every ounce of gold sold to defend the $35 price drained reserves further and exposed the system's fragility. Between 1965 and 1967, the United States lost billions of dollars worth of gold. Dealers in London began to sense that the fixed price could not survive forever. Confidence, once unquestioned, began to crack. By the end of this period, the London Gold Pool was no longer a stabilizing force. It had become a desperate effort to maintain appearances. The more aggressively it acted, the clearer it became that the underlying problem could not be solved through secrecy or coordination. The market was testing the limits of control, and those limits were approaching fast. By 1967, the strain on the system had reached a breaking point. The gold market, which had been carefully managed for years, was now under constant pressure from speculators and foreign governments alike. Confidence was slipping, and once confidence begins to erode, no amount of coordination can fully restore it. The London Gold Pool, once seen as a quiet guardian of stability, was now fighting a battle it could no longer win. The first major shock came from Britain itself. In November 1967, the British government announced a sharp devaluation of the pound sterling. The decision sent shockwaves through global markets. Investors immediately questioned whether other major currencies, including the US dollar, would be next. Fear spread rapidly. If the pound could be devalued overnight, what guarantee existed that the dollar's link to gold was truly secure? The answer, increasingly, was none. As panic grew, investors rushed to convert paper currency into something tangible. Gold became the obvious choice. Demand surged in the London market, overwhelming the carefully calculated interventions of the gold pool. In just 2 weeks, nearly 400 tons of gold were sold from official reserves in a desperate attempt to hold the price at $35 per ounce. The scale of the selling was unprecedented. It was no longer subtle management, it was open defense. Despite these efforts, the pressure did not ease. Every sale confirmed what the market already suspected: the fixed price could not be maintained indefinitely. Instead of restoring confidence, the interventions fueled suspicion. Traders and governments alike began to act faster, afraid of being last in line when the gold ran out. What had once been a controlled operation now looked like a slow-motion run on the world's most important reserve asset. By March 1968, the situation had become untenable. Demand for gold in London reached such extreme levels that physical supplies could no longer keep up. The market was, quite literally, running out of metal to deliver. On March 14th, representatives of the London Gold Pool held an emergency meeting. The reality they faced was stark. Continuing to sell gold would only accelerate the collapse, yet stopping would expose the illusion they had worked so hard to maintain. That night they made an extraordinary decision. The London gold market would be closed entirely. For 2 weeks, the heart of global gold trading simply shut its doors in an attempt to halt the panic. It was an unprecedented move, signaling just how desperate the situation had become. Never before had such a central and symbolic market been suspended to preserve financial order. When the market reopened in late March, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The old system of unified pricing was gone. In its place emerged a two-tiered structure. Official transactions between central banks would continue at the fixed price of $35 per ounce. Meanwhile, private trading would be allowed to float freely, with prices determined by supply and demand. In effect, the world now had 2 prices for gold, one official and one real. This compromise was an admission of defeat, even if it was not publicly framed that way. Central banks agreed not to sell gold into the private market, hoping to preserve the appearance of stability in official channels. But outside those channels, the market spoke clearly. Gold quickly rose above $40 an ounce and continued climbing. The free market had finally broken through years of suppression. To most ordinary people, these changes appeared technical and distant, the kind of adjustment only bankers and economists would notice. But in reality, the collapse of the London Gold Pool marked the beginning of the end for the Bretton Woods system itself. The dam had cracked, and the pressure behind it was immense. The core problem remained unsolved. There were far more dollars in circulation than there was gold to back them. The United States now faced an impossible dilemma. Honoring its promise to redeem dollars for gold would eventually drain its remaining reserves completely. Breaking that promise, on the other hand, would shatter the foundation of the global monetary system. Politically, admitting the truth was unacceptable. For years after 1968, U.S. officials continued to insist that the dollar was as strong as ever, even as foreign governments quietly tested that claim. For a short time, the two-tiered system appeared to hold. Markets calmed and official statements declared stability restored. But this calm was built on denial. The U.S. government continued to spend heavily, financing the Vietnam War and expansive domestic programs. Each new dollar issued further weakened confidence. Foreign central banks accumulated massive dollar holdings, knowing that, in theory, those claims could still be converted into gold. By 1970, the arithmetic became impossible to ignore. The United States owed foreign governments more than $50 billion, yet held less than $10 billion worth of gold. Anyone who examined the numbers could see the contradiction. One by one, countries began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves, hoping to secure real value before the vaults were emptied. This was the ultimate consequence of the London Gold Pool's failure. The pool had delayed the reckoning, but in doing so, it had amplified the imbalance. By selling gold to defend an artificial price, central banks had weakened their own positions. Now the entire Western financial system stood exposed. Speculators understood this dynamic clearly.
Every official assurance about the dollar's strength was met with increased gold buying in the private market. Gold prices continued to rise, making the fixed $35 price look increasingly absurd. The gap between official claims and market reality grew wider with each passing month. What had once been a carefully maintained illusion was now openly mocked by the numbers themselves. Confidence once lost could not be restored through statements alone. In many ways, the story of the London gold pool mirrors nearly every attempt by governments to control markets. Intervention can work temporarily, it can create a sense of stability and buy time, but beneath the surface, pressures continue to build. When the system finally breaks, it does so with greater force precisely because of the delay. By 1968, President Richard Nixon was confronting a crisis with no easy solution. The United States was running large trade deficits, gold reserves were dangerously low, foreign governments were increasingly aggressive in demanding conversion. Continuing along the existing path risked a complete loss of gold. Something had to give. On August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation and the world. In a move that would redefine modern finance, he announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The so-called gold window was closed. With a single decision, the link between the dollar and gold was severed. The Bretton Woods system, defended for years by secrecy and intervention, effectively ended. From that moment forward, money was no longer anchored to metal. Currencies became purely fiat, backed by government decree and public trust, rather than physical reserves. The collapse of the London gold pool had been an early warning. Nixon's decision was the final confirmation that the old world had ended and a new, uncertain era had begun.
After Nixon's 1971 announcement, the global financial landscape shifted dramatically. Economists and bankers alike struggled to understand what would come next. The predictable anchor of gold was gone, replaced by a system entirely dependent on confidence, trust, and the ability of governments to manage economies. For decades, gold had been a symbol of stability, a tangible standard against which the world measured value. Now that symbol was gone, leaving a vacuum filled with speculation and uncertainty. Initially, reactions were mixed. Some investors welcomed the freedom to trade currencies without worrying about the rigid constraints of a fixed gold price. Others feared that untethered money would lead to instability, inflation, and the erosion of savings. Within weeks, currencies began to fluctuate more than they had in decades. The US dollar, previously considered the ultimate safe asset, lost value relative to other major currencies. The German mark and Japanese yen, tied to stable economies with disciplined monetary policies, began to gain strength. The end of Bretton Woods also exposed the vulnerability of countries heavily reliant on US dollars. Nations that had accumulated vast dollar reserves suddenly faced potential losses if the dollar depreciated. Some governments scrambled to diversify their holdings, converting dollars into other currencies, while others sought to increase their own gold reserves privately. Central banks had to learn quickly that the rules had changed. The world of fixed exchange rates was over, and a new era of floating currencies had begun. Meanwhile, the private gold market, which had been artificially constrained under the London gold pool, finally flourished. Gold prices soared, reflecting real-world demand rather than artificial quotas. Investors, wary of inflation and currency fluctuations, turned to gold as a hedge. Jewelry markets, bullion traders, and futures contracts all experienced surges in activity. What had once been a tightly controlled commodity now became a dynamic asset, its price a reflection of market psychology as much as intrinsic value. Inflation, which had been simmering beneath the surface for years, began to accelerate. Without the gold standard as a constraint, governments found it easier to print money to finance deficits. The 1970s witnessed a period of so-called stagflation, where slow economic growth was accompanied by rapidly rising prices. The absence of gold's stabilizing influence made it harder to maintain long-term fiscal discipline. For ordinary citizens, this meant that savings could lose value in a matter of years, and borrowing costs fluctuated unpredictably.
Internationally, the end of fixed exchange rates created both opportunity and tension. Countries could now adjust their currencies to make exports more competitive, but doing so risked sparking retaliatory measures. Trade balances became more volatile, and policymakers had to develop new tools to manage the impacts. Central banks became more active participants in currency markets, buying and selling reserves to influence exchange rates, essentially replacing the old gold interventions with a more complex web of financial maneuvers. For the United States, the immediate consequences were mixed. On one hand, the freedom from gold allowed the government to finance social programs and military expenditures without being limited by physical reserves. On the other hand, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency was now under scrutiny. Confidence in the U.S. economy and political system became the new backbone of global finance, replacing the tangible anchor of gold. This placed enormous pressure on policymakers to maintain credibility and discipline. Speculators quickly adapted to the new environment. Currency trading became a booming activity as market participants sought to profit from fluctuations. Futures markets expanded, and institutions developed increasingly sophisticated models to predict exchange rate movements. Risk management became a central concern, as the potential for profit came with the heightened danger of rapid losses. The collapse of the gold standard had transformed finance from a predictable system into a highly dynamic and sometimes volatile landscape. The psychological impact of the gold standard's collapse should not be underestimated. For centuries, people had equated money with physical value, whether gold or silver. Suddenly, the meaning of currency shifted. Money became an abstract promise rather than a tangible asset. This transition took time to internalize, and even decades later, gold remained a favored store of wealth for those skeptical of fiat currencies. The collective consciousness of investors, citizens, and policymakers alike had to adjust to a world where trust, rather than metal, defined value. Over the next few decades, the lessons of the London gold pool and the collapse of Bretton Woods continued to resonate. Economists debated the merits of fixed versus floating exchange rates, the role of gold as a hedge against inflation, and the limits of government intervention. Financial crises in later years, such as the Latin American debt crises of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, and even the 2008 global financial collapse, echoed themes first visible in the 1960s. Markets are fragile, trust is fragile, and attempts to suppress economic realities often exacerbate eventual corrections. Yet, amid the turmoil, the shift also brought innovation. Floating currencies encouraged the development of global financial markets, derivatives, and investment strategies that would have been impossible under rigid gold constraints. Investors gained new tools to manage risk and exploit opportunity. Corporations could hedge against currency fluctuations and expand international operations more efficiently. Central banks became more sophisticated in their approach to monetary policy, using interest rates, reserve requirements, and open market operations to influence their economies without the direct limitation of gold. By the 1980s, a new equilibrium had emerged. While gold continued to be valuable as a hedge and a store of wealth, it no longer dominated the global system. Currencies moved independently, central banks developed flexible strategies, and financial markets matured. The dramatic events of the 1960s and early 1970s, including the collapse of the London gold pool, were recognized as a turning point, a moment when the world transitioned from an age of metal-backed money to one dominated by fiat currency, trust, and market perception. In retrospect, the collapse of the London gold pool offers several enduring lessons. It demonstrates the limits of government intervention when market forces are fundamentally misaligned with policy. It illustrates the dangers of creating artificial scarcity or price controls, even with the best intentions. And it underscores the psychological dimension of finance. Trust, and expectation are as real as gold in shaping economic outcomes. The events of 1968 to 1971 were more than a technical adjustment. They were a profound transformation in how humanity conceptualizes and manages wealth. The transition from gold-backed currency to fiat currency fundamentally reshaped the global economy. It enabled unprecedented growth in international trade, investment, and financial innovation, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Trust replaced gold as the ultimate standard, and the consequences of eroded confidence became increasingly apparent in later crises. The collapse of the London gold pool thus stands not only as a story of a specific market intervention, but as a pivotal moment in the evolution of modern finance, illustrating the delicate balance between policy, perception, and economic reality.